Okay. Hello, everyone, and welcome to EWB-USA's Disaster Response and Recovery Intro webinar. My name is Julia Suzars, and I am the Project Coordinator for Engineering Service Corps. So to get us started on today's call, I'm going to go over the purpose and agenda. We decided to have today's webinar because EWB-USA is increasing our role in disaster response and recovery, and readiness for that role requires us to grow our roster of volunteers. The aim of this webinar is to provide more information on the work we're doing in disaster response and recovery so that those of you interested are better informed to join our roster, and we may establish a core group of volunteers with the skills that we need. So today's call will start with introductions from the various speakers, and the presentation itself should only last around 35 minutes, which will leave 15 minutes for Q&A. Because there are so many of you on the call, we do ask that everybody stay muted throughout the call, and that if you have a question at any point, that you submit it to me via Zoom chat. And then we will wrap up the presentation, and it should take less than 5 minutes. All right, so on to introductions. As I mentioned, my name is Julia Suzars, and I am the Project Coordinator for Engineering Service Corps. My role consists of managing project logistics along with our clients, and then also managing volunteers. I have a background in refugee assistance and a master's degree in international development. On to you, Kevin Hagan.
Yeah, this is Kevin Hagan, one of the project managers in Engineering Service Corps. I've worked for several years with EWB, volunteer and on staff, and through a range of different things, and was one of the co-founders of the Engineering Service Corps, and have remained involved in both administratively and in the field work. Lauren?
So it looks like Lauren and Mike are having some technical difficulties.
Okay.
So I'm going to go ahead and just quickly introduce them. Lauren is our domestic project manager for Community Engineering Corps, and she has a background in community and disaster resilience and recovery, and an MS in disaster resilience and leadership. It looks like Mike was able to join. So Mike, if you can go ahead and introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Mike Paddock, and I'm a co-founder of the Engineering Service Corps. Been involved with EWB since 2004, and also had the pleasure of spending 2 terms on the board of directors, and have had a chance to also respond to several different disasters, both in Ethiopia and down in Guatemala.
Okay, and I see that Lauren was able to join finally. So Lauren, do you have any other information you want to, or any more background on yourself that you want to let everybody know about?
I'll just say I also have worked in disaster recovery, more in the long-term recovery, both in New Orleans and then here in Colorado following the floods in 2013. So I'm always happy to talk more about those experiences, but I'll leave it there for now.
All right, so this is Kevin again, and so we'll run through the presentation here. I'm going to take the first part and provide a little bit of kind of background, just a little bit more detail as to what we're about here. The bullet items here, the 40 members for just rapid response and 40 members for long-term assignments, is kind of a goal that we've set, and that reflects this need for capacity building. And also, and I'll talk about it later, but that rapid response and that long-term assignment, those are kind of the extremes of what we're about here, and present some of the challenges in terms of capacity building. We have other things going on as well in terms of building capacity. Building some training protocols in terms of both inside internal EWB and external training, so that people are prepared for the work. And then there is some equipment that is required, some policies and practices that we're arranging to all part of capacity building. Next slide, please. So let me set a little bit more of the stage. So for those, I see that some of the people attending are familiar with EWB and some probably not, or at least names that I don't recognize. So let me give you just a thumbnail of the situation we're with here. So the mission of EWB broadly is been defined for quite a long time is that we build a better world through engineering projects that empower communities to meet their basic human needs. And that has largely been done in the context of community development. It's really been the standing focus. Disaster response and overlays community development. It's not exactly the same thing, but there's quite a lot, probably more overlap than we have shown in that graphic. But I want to point out that it's a little bit of an evolution for EWB. Claire, I think from the Community Service Corps, you had a little bit different perspective on that as well.
This is Lauren, and I'll talk a little bit about how Community Engineering Corps is a little bit different. We have taken this mission and applied it locally to the United States. And so it's very similar in that we're looking to help communities get the infrastructure that they need so that they're able to thrive. And the way we're doing that through Community Engineering Corps is in partnership with two other organizations, the American Water Works Association and the American Society of Civil Engineers. So I think we have several people on the line today who are from either of those organizations, and we really want to say thank you for joining us, and we hope that you're able to help us in our disaster work that we're stepping into in recent times, and hopefully, over the next several years as well as the need arises. And so anyone from those three organizations, EWB, AWWA, or ASC, is welcome to volunteer with Community Engineering Corps, and I'll leave it there.
Okay. So let me just give you another little bit of background kind of on disaster response generally. Different agencies will talk about disaster response in somewhat different terms, but broadly it is described the way it is in this graphic. The disaster in this graphic is marked by that vertical red line. So ideally there has been some preparedness ongoing in advance, and sometimes there is, but often there is not. The short term, which is defined here as occurring in days, that starts out with search and rescue and that sort of thing. Well, we're not really involved in that. But it also phases very quickly into tents and tarps, and from our perspective, it importantly phases very quickly into needing to understand what the real magnitude of the disaster is, so damage assessment, and evaluation of the capacity of the community or the island or the country or whatever the impacted area is, their capacity to respond. And so that's our engagement in the rapid response, the early work. Much of our work then is in that what is labeled the intermediate, which tends to run for weeks or months. And so that's probably the bigger piece of our work from in general. The long term, probably not so much. The long term running into the years is tending to be beyond our scope, generally anyway. So that's just kind of so we understand when we talk short term or immediate, intermediate, and so forth. Next slide, please. Again, from the Service Corps perspective, shown on the right there, much of our work is related to or working for various agencies. We rarely work, I guess you'd say, on our own. So we are rarely the implementer. We are normally a consultant, providing advice and so forth. On the left bullet points there, much of what we're doing is damage and risk assessment, capacity assessment for the recovery, and then providing support for the recovery. Lauren, if you wanted to come in on the community engineering core, kind of how the services flow.
Sure. We provide much of the same services as what ESC does. We just do it here in the United States. And that includes territories like Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands. And we partner kind of with a broad range of different entities, anything from a community down to kind of, if you think of like an HOA or a local community leader, a neighborhood association, all the way up through, you know, more formal nonprofits or entities that are serving the public generally. We don't have any specific requirements so long as the organization is not a for-profit entity. That's really the only place we draw the line. So community for us is very loosely defined, and we tend to work with people on whatever level they approach us at.
All right, thanks. Next slide. So just a quick comment. A lot of the work that the Service Corps has been doing has been related to the UNDP, on the upper left there, United Nations Development Program, working for them. They have been the client. And I just took a clip off their webpage, the lower right there, indicating their focus on disaster recovery. So it's a big focus for them, and it's a pretty natural fit for us. Next slide. So just very quickly, kind of a history of disaster work through EWB. The first thing that I'm aware of that was done, there was a little bit of work in Haiti that was quite indirect, and for the most part, it was just, us referring members to other agencies that needed help. We're a little bit more directly involved in the Nepal earthquake, provided some service through some NGOs. Sierra Leone, the epidemic was one of the first long-term assignments where we had people on site for 3 to 6 months. Ecuador earthquake was kind of the opposite. It was very short, pretty much, and very pleasing, I guess one would say. That it turned out that the local country capabilities were really surprisingly good, and so they really didn't need much help from us. It was a good thing. The Ethiopia drought response, interesting difference from the others in that it's it's a disaster, but it's a slow onset disaster. And then the Dominica hurricane, and you'll hear more about that in a couple minutes. Next slide.
So in terms of Community Engineering Corps, we're, as a younger program, initially our projects were not focused directly on disaster recovery. So this is new territory for us, which is why our list is a little bit shorter. Obviously in the past year in California, there have been several kind of monumental fires across the state. And so we have several projects in Northern California helping with fire recovery efforts. And then we also have projects in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands after the hurricanes that went through, and everyone's familiar from the news the damage that's been done there. So there's still quite a lot of need in those areas, and we're hoping to do more outreach to get more projects so that we can be involved in the recovery as it continues over the next long several years, likely. And just to go back to a previous slide, domestically, we do tend to get more into the long-term recovery work just because we are local to a lot of the areas. And so it's just much more feasible for us to stay involved in the long term. So yeah, hopefully in Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands in particular, that is our aim.
Okay, so this is Mike, and I thought it might be good to just walk through what you might expect on one of these assignments, especially an assignment internationally with the United Nations Development Program. The UNDP focuses primarily on housing. That's where they've asked for the most assistance for us from the Engineering Service Corps, and is likely where we'll have additional responses beyond Dominica. So as Kevin had indicated, the first step was a rapid response team, and we arrived in Dominica about, I guess, 10 days after Maria had left. And I can tell you that it was pretty shocking. There was not a leaf to be found on a tree, and there were some places that the grass was actually blowing off the soil. It was incredible what 180-mile-an-hour winds could do. And so in that particular event, especially since we were so close to when the disaster had occurred, we needed to come completely self-prepared. So that meant we came with our own food, our own shelter in the form of a tent, sleeping bag, sleeping pad, water filter to filter water, so that we were completely, if you will, self-contained and be able to operate. Since we are with the United Nations Development Program, they take care of the security. So in our case, we were camped out in the stadium with the security force as part of the response. Next slide. So in Dominica, the hurricane hit the entire island. So it's not like other disasters that we've seen, like even in Haiti, where a portion of the country was damaged. In this case, it was the entire island was completely hit. There was not a structure that was spared. And so this significantly impacted the government operations. There was, all of their infrastructure was down. Many of their buildings were severely damaged or not able to be occupied, and communication was non-existent. There was 3 days that there was no communication on the island until they were able to get some emergency communication up and running. Next slide. But the people of Dominica are very proud and very resilient. One of the key decisions that was made to start the shelter challenge was to shelter in place. So generally on these events, you have two choices. You can either have shelters set up for people to go to, or you can shelter in place. Both of them have advantages and disadvantages. And we did have a couple of dozen shelters around the island, but predominantly the objective was for people to shelter in place, which basically what that means is that providing tarps and tents to people so that they could live on their existing property and post-hurricane. Of course, that provides some logistical challenges because you still have to figure out a way to feed them and get water to them. But fortunately, the transportation network was pretty much intact, and that's what really led to that decision and made it possible. Next slide. So the several steps that we used in the housing program, and it all starts with the building damage assessment. The decision was made to use all the local employees of the government. So we had about 130 assessors that were trained. They were formed into 40 teams that would go out and do the building damage assessments. Our job was to provide the training for these groups, as well as provide some assistance to them during their actual assessment activities. You can see here that the training is conducted in the dark because we had no electricity at the time. There were several challenges, of course, that we had with that. For example, transportation. We didn't have 40 vehicles to transport teams around. So fortunately, there were, on Dominica, there's a lot of bicycles for tourists, obviously not a lot of tourists post-Maria. So we were able to utilize the bicycles for the teams to ride around and do their assessment activities. Next slide. This is just a slide showing that we went out in the field, certainly no lack of examples to go out and do assessments on. And it was very important that we had consistency across these teams when they did their work so that the data would be reliable and the government as well as the United Nations could use that to inform the response. Next slide. This just gives you an idea of the 29,431 assessments that were done. We tag those as you can see a 4-color scheme. And the damage on the island, about 50% of the island, of the structures were completely damaged or heavily damaged. So, and you can see just from the visual that it was pretty evenly distributed across the entire country. Next slide. Our second step, which was pretty exciting for me, building damage assessments have been around for a long time, but the old method was basically have that information filled out on paper, and by the time it was pulled together and summarized, it could be months, if not even longer, maybe up to a year before the data was available. Microsoft made a team of 12 people available to us full-time during this period and allowed us to use and built an app that we could use to collect the data real time. And that really provided 2 big advantages. One, we could do real-time quality control, which meant that we could look at each individual team and how they were doing in the assessment. And if something didn't look correct, for example, one team maybe was flagging too many reds or too many greens, we could send out, or we could go out and then do some additional training for them so that we could get consistency on the fly, quality control, if you will, on the fly, instead of waiting until all the data is processed at the end. The second thing is we were able to collect the data and use it to drive data-informed decisions. So we revised the housing standards using the data that we collected. And this was really powerful because we could go not only to the politicians, the decision makers, but also the public and show them that based upon this information, we were able to determine, for example, that a hip roof is 5 times more likely to withstand the winds than a gable roof. And so that's why we're revising these types of standards. And so it was really added a lot of credibility to the code changes that we were proposing. Next slide. The code was visually based because part of it was, the objective was to inform the property owners and the general public about what the changes were and why. Next slide. But it also got down into details for builders. So, for example, laying out screw patterns on individual sheets of galvanized iron and how those screws need to be inserted so that we could withstand future events. Next slide. The next step, step 3, was then to take that information out and provide training. And again, communication was very limited, still is frankly limited on the island. So we went out, conducted 15 sessions around the island where we trained 350 contractors and construction managers on the design changes. And I have to say that this was one of the most enjoyable things that I had during my stay there, because it was great to mix it up with builders, have discussions with them, get their input. We revised the standards 10 different times based upon input that we received from them. Had great discussions and exchanges on how much additional cost these proposed changes were going to be, because one of the things that I was very sensitive to is that we were asking people to invest more in their homes at exactly the time that they had less. They all sustained significant amount of damages, and unfortunately we could not come up with a way to rebuild the structures more resiliently without adding additional cost. Next step. So after we educated the builders, we needed to take the message out to the public. And again, took a page out of the book that we needed to go to the public instead of trying to get the word out and have them come to us. So We built a series of model roofs, made them small enough that they could be loaded in the back of a pickup truck, went out to hardware stores and community centers and churches, and basically set up camp and got the word out on how you can rebuild your roof in such a manner that it would be more resilient. All the time handing out additional copies of the revised housing guidelines. And it was really interesting to me how this communication happened, especially in the early days, because the radio stations weren't functioning yet. The towers were still down. So this was literally drive up and down the street with a blowhorn, make the announcement that there was going to be a meeting at 7 o'clock that night or 9 o'clock in the morning. And then the people responded. They knew their obligation was to share this information with their neighbors, kind of like in the old days, so to speak, so that word would get out and they could come to the events. Next slide. And so we continue to do this outreach activity, engaging the public, not only in these with these roofs, but also putting out posters and other information to try to get the word out as best we can to the public, as well as the financial institutions, because it turns out that the financial institutions are probably going to be 1 or 2 steps ahead of the government on enforcement. You see, the financial institutions took a significant beating financially due to the storm, as they all held mortgages and loans against the structures that were damaged. And so they're highly motivated to make sure that the reconstruction efforts are going to be able to withstand future events. So they were very eager to learn about what those measures were, how much they were needed to be, how much additional costs needed to be built into loans. And then until the government got its enforcement procedures ramped up, they stepped in and started doing their own inspections to make sure that the new codes are being followed during these events. Next slide.
Okay, thanks, Mike. This is Kevin again. So I want to emphasize that there's kind of a couple of extremes that are challenges for us in doing this work. Certainly there are technical challenges and so forth, but the international work is largely kind of falls across there's 2 ends of that arrow. The rapid deployment, we're talking about 72 hours more or less to deploy, so that's a challenge. Not real long term; it might only be 3 weeks or something, but rapidly. And then the longer deployments, which might be a month or 3 months or 6 months, and that again is a challenge for a lot of people to be able to do that. So that's all about why we are building the capacity. Lauren, I know from the domestic standpoint, probably those challenges aren't quite the same in the domestic program.
Yeah, given the proximity to a lot of our work sites, people in their own communities tend to step forward and say, what can we do? How can we help? And so typically you're looking at, a half-hour drive, an hour drive, or even just, a flight across the country, but something that's feasible on a long weekend, for example. So I think domestically we're more looking for potentially people who can deploy quickly, not with any requirements, and I think we talk about this a little bit later, but just the ability to be responsive in a disaster scenario. But I think rather than being somewhere for several weeks at a time, I think our domestic assignments would more look like frequent travel to the site, whether that's flying out, once every couple of weeks to do whatever assessments need to be done or take meetings, or it's driving, an hour down the way. So yeah, it just looks a little bit differently because we're working domestically.
Thanks. Another point I wanted to make on this one, and this probably is true. If you could you, Julia, could you back? There you go. Just very quickly, it's probably true of both programs, but certainly the Service Corps. It is pretty client and agency driven. And there's a pretty high expectation in terms of the level of professional service. These are challenging situations, and people need a high level of service, and there's some high expectation for what we do. On the other hand, in terms of the people that have been doing this with us, I think that you would find most of them would report that they really felt like they made a difference. That not only are the expectations high, but the potential for impact is also high. So it's just kind of ups the ante from much of the other work. Next slide. So the rapid deployment, largely we're talking about 72-hour response, more or less. Might be 2 or 3 week, even 4 week missions. So it's rapid. It's key to be there soon, because you need to understand what the damage is, and you need to understand what the capability of the response is. Lauren, do you want to, I think you already mentioned that a little bit from the CE side, that again, some of the need is for rapid deployment.
Yeah, pretty much what I said before. We just want to be as responsive as possible to our communities. So it all just depends on when they reach out for assistance and when they're available for meeting with folks. So just having general open availability is always preferable.
Right. So in terms of engagement, certainly there are a range of disciplines. A lot of this is civil and structural related, and we're talking about the housing. But there can be other disciplines as well. Certainly if it's a flooding related event, hydrology and hydraulics and all that sort of things is a key. Landslides, either because of rain events or seismic events. So there's geotech can be a very prominent need. So there are a range of needs. And there can be others. We haven't talked a lot about any of the other infrastructure, but there's certainly, as we are there are other infrastructure things that can become prominent. So that could be a wide range of technical capabilities. The rapid deployment, particularly on the international side, certainly can be challenging working conditions, living conditions, Mike talked about, and I think that would be probably the rule rather than the exception in those rapid deployments. Next slide, please. So the recovery support, this is going to run on for some period of time. Both the rapid and the longer term deployments in the international situation, we're largely looking for the client agency. UNDP has been the biggest one to cover costs, so the travel costs and the per diems and so forth. I know on the Lauren, on the domestic side, the may not be as consistently anyway the ability to cover costs for travel.
Yeah, it's entirely dependent on who we're working with and where the funding is coming from. So we do have some projects where we're able to cover costs or reimburse costs, but it's just not guaranteed because we don't always work with agencies that have that type of funding available. So it's, as we can, we will.
Sure.
Not.
Just a couple of comments on this bottom bar. It kind of reflects a scope of the work that we're often involved with. Building damage assessment certainly is a prominent one. Really nothing of substance in terms of the reconstruction can occur till you understand what the damage is. But then understanding what the building standards and codes are, and what's the real application, before the event. What is the level of inspection and so forth. And what do the supply chains look like? Are they using good materials? What about the common building practices? What about the design and construction people? What is the local engineering capability and so forth? Probably is more than it looks like when you walk in. but there's a key to understand what that is, and it's a key for the other agencies, all of the agencies, to understand that there is that local capability and to use it. Again, there can be challenging working and living conditions. These places, the power may not be on for very much for quite a long time. So you should expect that it could be somewhat challenging situation to operate in. Next slide, please. So I think this, Julia, is you, I think, right?
Yeah, so we, as Kevin mentioned, we're looking for a really wide range of disciplines. And we're looking for people that have experience related to construction, experience with seismic design, high wind design, geotechnical experience, experiencing with flooding, and even project management experience, particularly if it's related to an emergency setting. As Kevin mentioned, it's important that you're able to handle challenging conditions, particularly for those of you interested in working with Engineering Service Corps. Those of you that have experience working in around the world or in a lesser developed regions is a plus. For quick availability, we're looking for people that are available to deploy within 72 hours, and long-term availability for recovery support. 1 to 6 months is the assignment length, depending on the situation. I also want to note that ESC volunteers must be EWB-US members to deploy. So that doesn't mean that you have to be a member to apply to our roster, or even if we do select you to be on a roster, you don't have to be a member. Just that before you deploy on a trip, you would have to become a member. And that just allows us to make sure you're covered by our travel and liability insurance. Lauren, do you want to chime in on what CE Corps is looking for?
I think pretty much we're looking for a lot of the same things in terms of capabilities, just obviously being applied in a domestic context. So there's, I think we're looking for the same things. So what you said, I think, is relevant for us as well.
Great. Okay, so now on to sort of next steps. So for those of you that are interested in joining our roster, you can apply through our Volunteer Opportunities Board. We also have a few courses that we recommend that those of you interested in joining our roster take. The first is Mission Ready, which is an online training for humanitarian professionals put on by the UK organization Red R. The second is the Sphere Project, which offers an e-learning course that brings the Sphere Handbook to life through various scenarios. Some of you may know the Sphere Handbook is one of the most widely known and recognized set of principles and standards in life-saving areas of humanitarian response. CE Corps is currently looking for more local resources, and they're being identified for training. For those of you interested in volunteering with Engineering Service Corps, it's particularly important that you are prepared medically. So that means, having all of your routine vaccinations up to date, and that you are able to quickly get prescriptions if need be. You may be interviewed by CE Corps and ESC, so being prepared for that if you do apply for the roster. We also suggest that those of you interested in rapid deployment, pack a ready bag. And finally, that those of you interested, talk to your family and employer about the possibility of you volunteering in the disaster response sector. So that brings us to Q&A. For those of you that have any questions, you can submit them to me via Zoom chat. Right now, we only have one question. So before we start doing Q&A, Kevin, I don't know if you have any observations that you really want to quickly go over, and then I'll get the ball rolling once we receive a few more questions.
Yeah, well, so maybe just the way we present this, maybe just a kind of an observation about the way we present it. There's again this kind of increased challenge and increased reward. You heard Mike talk about that work in Dominica, and challenging work, long time, and there's technical challenge to it certainly, but a lot of the challenges is how do you turn a well, really the society in terms of how they build their homes. That's not something that just turns on a dime. You issue a new guideline and says, well, this is the way you should do it. Well, things don't change that quickly. It's very challenging, and I think very rewarding that over time, the island of Dominica, which is the government is intending that it should become the first nation designed really to be resilient to the climate change. We're having a tremendous impact on that. I just can't overemphasize how important the result of our work, and Mike and all of the others that have spent a lot of time there is. So it's challenging, but it is highly rewarding as well. So yeah, Julia, let's see what kind of questions you've got.
We have a few questions. The first question is if we have ever used drones or plan on using drones.
So I guess I can address this one. That we really have not, and it is an active topic of conversation whether drones would be useful in disaster response, and they certainly are. The medical or search and rescue sectors certainly use drones to improve their ability to do their work. At this point, we have not in our phase the building damage assessment. That it's kind of inherently an arm's length type thing, partly because you need to talk to the owners and the neighbors and understand. There's a collapsed home. Well, it may have been collapsed before the event. Well, you don't find that out, from satellite photography, which is available very quickly after an event. And you probably would not figure that out from a drone either. So I think it is yet to be determined just how drones will fit into the thing. I have the opinion that there will be some use for them certainly in isolated situations where it's just not possible to get a view of something, maybe because it's too dangerous. So undoubtedly there'll be use for them.
Okay, next question is, do you have a need for engineers without a civil engineering background? All of the skills we've mentioned sort of were in the civil engineering sphere.
Well, yeah, taken rather broadly, I guess you could say they're kind of civil engineering and affiliated professions. Some of the hydrology, hydraulics, geotech, and so forth really are not civil, but they're often affiliated with civil. I would encourage even people with other backgrounds, say electrical as an example, we'd like to hear from you as well, and start to build some of that capability as well. The UNDP, as Mike mentioned, their real focus is housing, and so there's not so in that context. There's not so much electrical, for example, but there's certainly a tremendous amount of electrical damage in most of these kinds of situations, and so we would like to begin to build that capability as well. So even the broader ones, they're further from civil engineering. Yes, we would encourage you to apply.
Okay. Next question is, are there any foreign language requirements?
I would not term it as requirements. Certainly there are advantages. It happens, we keep using Dominica as an example, but that's largely an English-speaking island, and some of the islands in the Caribbean are. Many, the potential is to respond in many places. Much of Latin America, Spanish would be a huge advantage, a critical advantage for the team to respond. But there could be responses in almost any part of the world, and so any language is going to be an advantage, whether it's French or any other local language. If the event occurs, and if we could find someone If we could have found someone who spoke Nepali during the Nepal response, it would have been a huge advantage.
So the next question is, how do you tell EWB that you could deploy in 72 hours? And also, how do you apply? I think I can answer this question. So the application is online. It's on our volunteer opportunities board, and you can apply through there. But also, we will be sending these slides out tomorrow to everyone that attended, and you can click on the link in the slide and it will take you right to the application form. It's a quick form that's easy to fill out. So how you would tell us that you can deploy in 72 hours, you could either tell us in that application form in the text box, or if you are selected for an interview, we'll call you and discuss availability then.
And if I could just maybe put one thing on top of that, we understand that everybody is not going to always be able to respond at 72 hours notice. And so, your interest in that and indicating that you are available to do that doesn't mean that we're going to expect you to be able to do it every time. Life gets in the way, and that's not going to happen. So, so if you might often be available on that kind of short notice, that's what we really want to hear.
Okay, next question is, how much buy-in do you need / get from the local government?
Mike, you had maybe some really interesting examples of that. You want to jump on that one?
Yeah, so and I'll speak specifically to the UNDP work, the Service Corps work, and I guess frankly even the work that we did with OF-AFTA in Ethiopia. The local government has to first of all invite the response to come in. So the government of Dominica or the government of Ethiopia would ask for assistance. That's the trigger to even begin the response. And with that response, usually there are some conditions. And as we like to say in Dominica, the hurricane did a lot of damage, but it did not blow away the government. So the government's still in charge. So the decisions still rest with the sovereign nation that go through. So as we do our work, it's really hand in glove. But matter of fact, I would say, our client in Dominica is more the housing and physical planning ministries than it is UNDP. UNDP is there to provide assistance to those entities, but the decisions lay with the local government.
Okay, so the next question is, there a way for young engineers or recent grads to become involved right now?
So I'll address that. So probably, so what's the definition of young? I suppose first of all, is somebody's right out of college. We probably are not going to have use for them on the rapid response. On the longer term deployments, we may. In Dominica right now, we've had people in Dominica for ever since last October, I guess it was, and up to as many as 6 people. Right now, we have 1 or 2 relatively young people, and so we can certainly mix some younger staff into some of those deployments, and getting that experience or getting experience through the ICP program, the International Chapter program at EWB, would also be a big plus.
Yeah, Lauren, I don't know, do you have, does CE Corps have anything to add to having younger engineers or recent grads?
Yeah, I was going to say that also in the longer term recovery projects, those tend to be more open to younger folks and people who are just out of school. We do obviously have mentorship, available for all of our projects, especially for students, but also for folks who are just out of school. We would want to make sure that they're on teams with a diverse group across the different levels of experience. But I think there's definitely a place for participation in the longer term recovery projects.
So the next question is someone stating that they're retired and still in good health, but they're wondering if there's an age limitation for volunteering.
No.
Yeah.
we are sometimes referred to as the gray hairs anyway. So no, I'd say the situation really was what the question said, which somebody is in good health and they can do this. We'd welcome them.
The next question is this limited to residential only, which I'm not entirely sure what that means, but possibly if you're referencing if this is only for people that are U.S. citizens. For ESC, we have many volunteers that are not U.S. citizens. We have volunteers from Canada and Australia, for instance. So no, you do not have to be a U.S. citizen. Lauren, do you want to speak to CE Corps?
Yeah, for Community Engineering Corps, because we're in the U.S., we do ask that whoever's leading the project as the responsible engineer in charge is licensed in the state where the service is being performed.
So next question is, would the work one performed be hands-on construction, carpentry, plumbing, engineering design, or both depending on the condition?
So it's maybe Julie, do you want to mute everybody once and then I'll
Yes.
back on again? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. No, there'd be pretty limited amount, and this is pretty true of the Service Corps in general, by the way. We are much more likely to be doing kind of the engineering professional type work, and rarely are going to be doing the physical construction, say, and it's partly because even in these disaster situations, there's rarely, if ever, much lack of local people who can and are able, and need the work. So that's really not what we're there for. Pretty limited amount of the actual construction, or even being the implementer, the contract implementer. We're typically not that either.
And this is Lauren. Domestically, we do not do construction on any projects because we do not, typically, none of our volunteers are licensed contractors, licensed to do that type of work in the U.S. So we do not do construction at all.
Next question is, are travel expenses covered for longer distance flights? So for Engineering Service Corps, flights are covered. Our client agencies cover all travel costs. Lauren, for CE Corps, a domestic flight would likely not be covered depending on the situation.
Yeah, it goes back to funding, the conversation earlier. It just depends on our funding source, but it's not a guarantee.
Okay, next question is, do you need to be a PE or similar, and what training is required before deployment?
A little bit hard to call. We have used people who are not have, let's say, more construction experience, because construction process and management and so forth is one of the issues is how well that's being done and so forth. So it wouldn't always be an engineer. So there's a range of capabilities needed.
Okay, the next question is if we are only working on residential buildings or other types of buildings.
So it probably is a range. Now, in the specific case, which is kind of our heaviest focus, which is UNDP, their heaviest focus in the context of everything else going on is housing. So in that case, that makes our heaviest focus on housing. Now, it's not exclusively that. Even in Dominica, we had an expert come in to look at the port. They needed somebody some advice on their port. That probably is not an uncommon situation. So there could be a wider range of things than just housing. That sounds too limited, I think, in general. And I'm sure it would be too limited in terms of the CE core as well.
Yeah, and I think, Kevin, we also had quite a bit of work with other public structures. So those would be things like schools, community centers, things like that.
And CE core is the same. We do a little bit of everything.
Okay, the final question for today is going to be if, Mike, you could explain how the assessment differs from ATC second responder assessments.
Excellent question. So this really comes down to and this is why we need to be there so early, right after the response, because what is the purpose of doing the damage assessment is always a hotly discussed topic. So, of course, here in the U.S., when you do a FEMA inspection, the primary purpose of it is for health and safety. Is the building occupiable or not? But sometimes in these responses, that's not necessarily the case. In Dominica, they did not post the placards on the buildings. It was really more of a data gathering exercise to inform a response. So the assessment was different than the ATC training. Included a lot of other things other than just damage assessment, including data about the vulnerability of the occupants so that they could determine who should have the priority for receiving aid, for example. And then I know, like in Ecuador, the assessments there, really the primary mission was to determine if the building was salvageable or not. If it wasn't salvageable, the Army was following up right behind the teams and doing complete demolition. So ATC training is certainly or FEMA building damage assessment training is certainly beneficial, and I would recommend that you do it. But the actual response is going to probably be a customized approach based upon what the government's decision on what they want to use the data for.
Okay, so due to time, we're going to move on to the conclusion of the webinar. If you had a question that didn't get answered, I've included my information as well as Lauren's information, and when we send out the slides tomorrow, we'll have access to that. We've also included a few additional resources to provide more context for those of you looking for more information. We really want to say thank you to all of you for taking the time out of your evening to join us today, and we really hope that we'll be working with some of you soon. So that wraps up our webinar for tonight, and thank you again. Everyone, have a great evening.